Classical models of development took little heed of the environment. Indeed, it was not until the 1970s that questions of sustainability entered the development lexicon. But today, the idea of sustainable development is commonly espoused. In 2013, the Chinese government was forced to acknowledge that the quality of air in Beijing was unhealthily bad. It was so bad that it hindered visibility. It was so bad that the World Health Organization asserted that breathing in Beijing was like smoking 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day. The American embassy there warned its employees to avoid trips outside. To illustrate how bad Beijing's air quality was, American public media produced interactive slideshows highlighting what famous scenes from San Francisco and other cities would look like if they had the same level of air pollution as Beijing. The results were startling. It's commonly believed that as countries develop, they produce more pollution. One need only consider the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain or look to contemporary cities in China to see examples. But it's important to note that this relation does not continue on forever. The relationship between pollution and environment and economic growth is not linear. Rather, as countries grow, demand for a clean environment begins to grow as well. At a particular point, the line reaches its apex, and further economic growth actually correlates to a cleaner environment. This is known as the environmental Kuznets curve. The environmental Kuznets curve, or EKC, suggests that as countries develop, pollution increases to a point. However, once the apex is reached, further development correlates with a decrease in pollution and an improvement in the environment. Multiple studies have found that specific environmental pollutants have different apexes. Particulates, for example, generally begin to decline at a per capita GDP of around $3,000, while lead levels do not reach their apex until a GDP per capita of almost $18,000. With respect to climate change, which we'll discuss in a later lecture, CO2 emissions appear to have no apex. That is, they continue to increase with the level of development in a linear fashion. Frankel and Rose's work also suggests that both trade openness and democracy lead to a flattening of the environmental Kuznets curve. A flatter curve means that there are lower levels of pollution at all levels of development, and that the apex of the curve is reached at an earlier level of economic growth. Thus, there is a positive correlation between democracy and demand for a clean environment. Conventional wisdom, as suggested by the environmental Kuznets curve, suggests that poverty facilitates environmental degradation. The poor pollute because they have no other choice. Concerned with immediate survival, the poor necessarily have a shorter time frame for analysis. Depleting resources for immediate survival, if necessary, is an obvious choice. It's not that the poor don't care about the environment, it's that they lack the capacity to make more sustainable decisions and to maintain a clean environment. In his classic text on the subject of informal urban settlements called Planet of the Slums, geographer Mike Davis describes a visit to the informal settlements of the Mutare Valley outside Nairobi, Kenya. Here, some 600,000 people living in thousands of tin and mud shanties, small, barely long enough to lay down in. Residents sleep on cardboard pieces on the dirt floor of the shanties. An estimated 1/3 of the adult residents of the Mutare Valley are HIV positive, and nearly everyone lives on less than $1 a day. Mutare Valley has no police or fire protection and no paved roads. 3 schools serve an estimated 70,000 children. There's no electricity or running water. Public toilets are officially shared, but as a result of structural adjustment programming, a 6-cent surcharge was imposed on their use. For the average resident of Mutare Valley, this fee represents about 10% of their daily wages. As a result, most can't afford to use the pay toilets and instead use the flying toilets, relieving themselves in plastic bags and throwing them into the Nairobi River, which also serves as the primary source of water in the valley. The experience of the Mutare Valley is replicated across the developing world, from the favela of Brazil to the Basti in India to the shanty towns of Indonesia and Vietnam. Globally, an estimated 1 billion people, some 1/7 of the world's total population, live in informal settlements. But their experiences also challenge the conventional wisdom about the relationship between the environment and development. As the 1990 Brundtland report noted, poverty is both a major cause of and a major effect of environmental problems. Frequently, environmental degradation is also linked to the world's growing population. The total number of people living on the Earth reached 1 billion in about 1800. It took 127 years for the population to add an extra billion, another 33 years to reach 3 billion. But since 1974, the world has been adding about a billion new inhabitants every 12 to 14 years. While this rate is expected to slow in the near future, the world's population is projected to exceed 9 billion people by the end of this century. We've previously discussed the concerns raised by growing population in the context of food and hunger, but overpopulation is also cited as an important concern in the context of environmental preservation. And as this map suggests, the vast majority of population growth occurring in the world is taking place in its poorest regions. Population growth is influenced by the demographic transition theory, which holds that the death rate frequently falls more quickly than the birth rate, leading to a sharp increase in population as countries develop. In this model, the pre-industrial stage is defined by both high birth rates and high death rates. But as countries develop, the death rate begins to decline as a result of improvements in food production and better access to medical care. Because most families are still reliant on subsistence agriculture for their livings, though, families tend to be larger. Additional children mean more economic opportunity, as children are viewed as net contributors to the household. But as societies industrialize, child labor becomes less common, and children become less economically active. Further, as women become employed outside the household, birth rates tend to fall. As a result, population growth rates begin to slow. Finally, a new equilibrium is reached, as birth rates and death rates are both relatively low. Population growth rates are also negatively correlated with the status of women in society. The most concrete measure of this relationship centers on the female literacy rate and female school enrollment rates as they relate to total fertility rates. As this graph shows, the percentage of women enrolled in secondary school increases, the total fertility rate, that is, the average number of child per woman, declines. This is because more educated women tend to marry later in life and have fewer children than less educated women. This is true in the United States and around the world. Overpopulation is certainly a cause for concern. In Africa's Sahel region, overpopulation has led to overgrazing of semi-arid lands, as farmers are forced to move onto more marginal lands to graze goats and cattle. In doing so, the environment becomes further degraded, as Hardin's model suggests it might. But it would be misleading to conclude that population growth is the only factor affecting the environment. Consumption matters too. If we use energy use as a surrogate for environmental impact, then a baby born in the United States has twice the environmental impact as one born in Sweden, 13 times one born in Brazil, 35 times as one born in India, 140 times as one born in Bangladesh or Kenya, and 280 times more than one born in Haiti or Nepal. To get at this relationship, the IPAT formula was developed. The formula says that environmental impact in the form of increased land and resource use, increased pollution, and so on, equals the population times the level of affluence or consumption times the level of technology. The IPAT formula problematizes the traditional focus on overpopulation as the sole or even the primary cause of environmental degradation by highlighting the intersection between population and the level of consumption. Including technology in the formula allows us to count improvements in technologies such as the more efficient use of technology or the use of renewable resources. From the perspective of many developing world leaders, the primary question should be consumption rather than population. This cartogram reflects the total level of consumption in each country. Larger countries have higher levels of consumption, smaller countries lower levels of consumption. Countries which run an ecological deficit, that is, countries whose levels of resource consumption and waste discharge exceed locally sustainable levels, appear in red. Those that run an ecological surplus appear in green. The cartogram illustrates two important features. First, most developing countries are both the largest consumers and tend to run the largest ecological deficits. Developing countries, by contrast, consume at much lower levels and frequently, but not always, run ecological surpluses. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the cartogram highlights the disconnect between global population and global consumption. Countries with high population growth rates like Ethiopia consume relatively little. China and India, with populations of more than 1 billion people each, appear slightly smaller than the United States, which has a population of about 315 million people. From the perspective of many in the developing world, then, the central question is not necessarily one of overpopulation, but one of overconsumption. Brought together under the consumption school, critics argue that environmental degradation is rooted ultimately in systems of unequal distribution and consumption, and that this inequality heightens political, economic, and social problems. This idea is captured in the ecological footprint, which is an effort to measure the total amount of land and ocean space necessary to maintain a particular lifestyle. It includes both the resources consumed and the waste produced, and converts these into biologically productive areas necessary to support these functions. These figures are calculated at the national level and provide a global ranking of countries by the number of hectares necessary to maintain that country's level of consumption. Globally, the average level of consumption requires about 2.9 hectares per person, which is about 20% above the Earth's sustaining capacity. The smallest footprint was found in Eritrea at about 1/3 of a hectare. The largest was the United Arab Emirates at almost 16 hectares per person. The United States used about 12 hectares per person, meaning that if everyone lived like the average American, we would need about 5 planet Earths to support the population. Conversely, the average American would need to reduce their footprint by about 85% to be considered sustainable. This, of course, raises the question of sustainable development more broadly. The common definition of sustainable development was offered by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. Their report, entitled Our Common Future, defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To be truly sustainable, development must encompass social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Leaving any one of these out would necessarily undermine the sustainability of a given project or program. But there are many who argue that the concept of sustainable development is hollow, and call for a rethinking of development more broadly. According to the French ecologist Vincent Chenet, for future generations to meet their own needs, the right term for developed countries should be a sustainable degrowth, but such a degrowth is off the agenda, at least in the context of the Sustainable Development Project.